Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the Public Order Emergency Commission, which is going on in Ottawa, which Joanna and I are, our organization is a party to that inquiry, and we're watching nonstop. So, Joanna, one thing that the commission has spent a lot of time on is this question of whether the entrenchment of protesters in Ottawa could have been prevented. What have we learned about this? And when it comes to the question of whether it could have been prevented, does it actually matter as it relates to whether the use of the Emergencies Act was justified?
So what we've learned is that, as we mentioned before, there was a lot of broken telephone uh, going on. So, for example, as you mentioned, it seems like Peter Slowly, the chief of the OPS, was warned that the protesters were well organized, that they were coming with enough money and food and supplies and they had booked up, I think, all of the hotels in the
Or
downtown
were at
core.
least claiming they were going to?
Right. And had sufficient funds and everything like that. And I think one thing that really came up, and some commentators have written about, is just normalcy bias. That it seems like Peter Slowly just like couldn't even believe that such a thing would happen because he was used to, the normal Ottawa protests, which go on a weekend and end. However, from the perspective, it's almost worrying to me that we're spending so much time in the weeds of that type of sort of cop drama, to put it in crude terms. It doesn't really go to whether the invocation of the Emergencies Act was justified. Protests can be inconvenient, they can be noisy, they can be disruptive, and we certainly have a lot of sympathy for the downtown Ottawa residents, but it doesn't make it a national public order emergency emerging from threats to the security of Canada. It's just not.
Absolutely. Now, one thing that does go to that question, though, is a number of policing witnesses who have said, in their words, that the Emergencies Act was not necessary to clear the protests, that the protests would have been cleared using the police powers that they already had, and they would have been cleared using the existing plan and on the same timeline. And a number of witnesses have said this. Now, they say that the tools under the Emergencies Act, they were helpful in various ways, but helpful is not the threshold for invoking this act. What can you tell us about that evidence, and does that create a problem for the government here?
Yeah, so I think all of the levels of police, we've seen evidence of the commission had come to the determination that they had existing legal tools, ranging from the tow trucks to bringing in officers to be sworn in. Which, one thing that we heard that we mentioned was, yes, the officers perhaps could have been, the additional reinforcements could have been sworn in a little bit more quickly, although it's not even clear if it would have made a difference with the invocation of the Emergencies Act. But what I would say is the talking point that the government seems to be shifting to, that even if there were other laws, the other laws and other commentators, of the other laws were not effective, that they weren't, because there was ongoing chaos. So in practice, they weren't effective. If you have the actual people on the ground, literally the RCMP, the OPS, and the OPP, all of the boots on the ground, looking at the situation and saying, we have all the tools that we need, need to just go do it. It's pretty difficult for the government to fall back on that practical necessity talking point, I would think.
I think so too. I think the fact that so many policing witnesses have said this, even policing witnesses who might otherwise be, liked the powers that they had under the Emergencies Act, I think that the government's in a tough spot here. Now, let's talk briefly about those tow trucks. There's been evidence about how the tow trucks that the government says they needed the Emergencies Act to get these tow trucks. But a lot of witnesses have focused on how the tow trucks actually were on their way before the Emergencies Act was invoked. What do we know about this, and what does it say about the government's justification?
Yeah, so I think it was Superintendent Bernier gave evidence this week that there was already arrangements made by the OPP to deploy 34 trucks to tow away the trucks that were occupying in Ottawa. And they had also made arrangements to grant anonymity to the willing drivers, even to indemnify them against any claims. Then there was a little bit of, again, broken telephone, where there was a cross-examination by a lawyer representing the federal government. Apparently that at some point that plan fell through, and ultimately the Emergencies Act was leveraged. It turned out, when the OPP commissioner, Thomas Carrick, was questioned by a commissioner lawyer about this, that, again, as you said, it wasn't that the plan fell through, it was just that the use of the Federal Emergencies Act to get the trucks towed was extremely helpful. And again, helpful is not the standard for the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
And I think some of Carrique's evidence related to the indemnification, which of course could also have been done under existing law. You don't need the Emergencies Act to indemnify a tow truck driver. We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back.